We are going to get started because I know some of the folks presenting and that are here also need to get on, so I want to respect everybody's time. So it is the Education Committee, Tuesday, August 15th for 18. And we're going to start with Assistant Superintendent's report.
Okay, I have a few items. First item is just some information regarding our full-service community school model that we're trying to enhance, K-12. That's not me, right? Usually it's me, but I hope it's not me. I know, yeah. We recently received a grant from a national organization, the Coalition of Community Schools. I believe only 4 or 5 districts in the state, in the country, were awarded this grant, and they were here in July to help us scale up our efforts, specifically in the area of health and medical supports for students. And so that was exciting to be a part of that conversation. It was a 3-day, I believe it was a 3-day, 2-day event. Superintendent was there. Were you there, Rosie? Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. A lot of different stakeholders were a part of that conversation, and part of the work that we'll be doing there is to focus on attendance and how we can improve attendance, specifically in those buildings, by improving the services that our students can access. Also recently, we hired a new Laura MacArthur principal. And I don't know if it came up last night. I had to leave early for an appointment, but we did hire a principal. He started on Monday, and the interview process was a little bit different this year, where we started with a smaller team that started with the initial round of interviews, and we brought in larger teams to help us pick the final candidate. And so we involved parents, community members, a principal rep, teacher reps, district representatives, and in the end, we feel like we got our best candidate. So we're excited, and we welcome him aboard, Clay Norman. And then lastly, I just wanted to share with you some of the work that we've done out of our office this summer. Over the last 2 years I've been here, there's been a lot of information disseminated out to staff in a variety of different ways, either through presentations, emails, small committee work, and we try to compile that into a very usable document for staff in regards to a couple different things. And so those are on my website, but I just wanted to share with you that was a pretty extensive project that we tried to put together over the summer. So we have an MTSS handbook that really outlines our expectations in common language for what that should look like in Duluth schools. We have our PLC handbook that the curriculum department had put in place last spring. We updated the teacher evaluation and development plan to incorporate what we're doing right now in regards to my learning plan and just district-wide procedures, so that's clear for all staff. And then all the work that we've done in the last year to support the continuous improvement teams, we put all that together in a sequential document so people can have access to those tools. So that's the bulk of my work for August.
Excellent. Thank you.
There's a question.
I see that. Member Oswald?
I was just curious, are links to your MTSS handbook and the PLC handbook on your webpage, or will we get copies of them?
No, they're on my website, yeah, and right, you can access them. Yep. Okay.
And the PLC handbook is also on the district curriculum webpage. There's a link to PLCs, and there's then a link to the handbook and other PLC information.
Perfect, thank you. Yep. And they're works in progress. I see us adding to them, so those will be working documents, but at least it's
just nice to know where we can reference them.
Yep,
we're curious.
Well, thank you for putting, she actually mentioned all resources are listed on her webpage. Any other questions? Okay, let's move on then to the informational presentations, and this will be a presentation by Assistant Superintendent Amy Starzecki, Dr. Tanya Lake, Director of Assessment and Evaluation, and Dr. Michael Carey, Director of Curriculum and Instruction. So,
all right. Well, I have the PowerPoint up here, so I have the clicker, so I can. Yep. No, I'm good. I was really organized today. So as we have questions, feel free to ask. You want to just kind of tag team between the three of us? And First thing we wanted to talk about, we wanted to give a kind of a broad overview as to what we're doing and the results that we're getting in regards to specifically looking at reading and math and student achievement across our whole district. And so I want to just start with some of the work we're doing at the district level, recognizing that there's much work happening at the school level that is in addition to this work. So this is just an update specifically on the work that we're overseeing and supporting. Ooh, that's little. Okay, I'm going to my presentation here. Oh, I don't have it in here. All right, I'm going to have to really read this. Okay. No, that's okay. I'll figure it out. Okay. So the first thing that we want to talk about is the continuous improvement teams, and the bulk of this work really happened in the last year. The purpose of our continuous improvement teams was to look at building instructional leadership capacity across staff. The message has been that we know principals can't do this work alone, and the most successful schools are very solid collaborative teams that work, both teachers and principals working together to identify solutions and implementing those initiatives. And we also have been working to really create that reflective mindset so that we know that we're always learning as educators and professionals, and how do we continue to learn to best meet the needs of our students. And so that's been really the focus on the staff development we've provided to those teams in the last year. What we have been working towards is teaching schools how they can review all of their different data sources as part of a comprehensive needs assessment. And we've really tried to focus on not just student outcome data, but recognizing that we need to monitor our initiatives to know if we're implementing them to fidelity, in addition to monitoring how our students are doing. Because if we're not implementing the initiatives, then we don't know if those are connected to our outcomes. So that's been I think a nice thank you that has been very helpful in kind of learning through those data sources. Sorry, very loud. We also have worked with them to design systems to look at evidence-based practices that can be implemented in all classrooms to support the student needs that were identified at each school. So as they did reviewed their data, they identified specific instructional practices that they think they should be implementing to support their students, and we looked at research and literature to identify what those should look like. And the work that they'll be doing this fall is really to articulate what should those instructional practices look like in each of our classrooms, and how we're going to monitor to make sure that's happening. One of the key things is we make sure we're implementing something before we start something new. And so that's been an important message too. And then also our continuous improvement teams have created a structure for us to monitor our work and our goals throughout the year. And I put my quote down here that I use often, but what gets monitored gets done. And so that's been important work that we've done with our teams.
The only thing I'd add to that is just kind of a reminder, even though we've been talking about continuous improvement teams now for about 18 months, I think, bear in mind, like the first 6 months, 2 school years ago, was really about the concept and idea and what it would take to get them into place. And then this last year was really getting those teams together and starting to do the training to help them understand what their role is and how it fits within school improvement. So, I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that this will be the first school year where we've had teams in place, they've been trained and understand their expectations going into the school year, and we'll have a full school year operating together, really with a firmer understanding of what their role is for school improvement and helping improve outcomes.
And what's nice about the work that we've done is they've done their needs assessment, they've set their goals, and they've identified already what they want to work on this year. So that's gonna be how the school year starts with those teams. Everything that we did also as a part of our continuous improvement process, we learned from the Department of Education. They use what's called implementation science, which is a process for effective implementation. It's based in research, so they have been a huge help for us to implement this, and they're really trying to replicate this process across other districts in the state. Another area of focus that we have been working on is really taking a look at our principals. We've had a lot of new principals in recent years, and so making sure we're focused on instructional leadership, and that's one of our key tasks as building leaders, and how do we do that work and how do we do that work well. Last year, our principals started working together as part of their own PLC. So what do we want our staff to know? How do we know if they know it? What do we do if they don't? And really identifying what are those effective practices we want to see happening in all of our classrooms. Our principals have been doing walkthroughs together, have been collecting data to see if they're seeing those practices in the classroom, and then they're working together to identify what are our staff development needs that we need to be supporting staff. Where do we see some of our needs and where do we see our strengths? And so that's been a newer process put in place, and the principals are looking forward to continuing that work this year and even diving deeper into that. I think the success of that work has really started to create a sense of collaboration across schools. You see schools working together, asking, how are you doing that? How can we replicate that across other classrooms, other schools? And so very similar to what we want our teachers to be doing in our schools, is working together to identify what are some instructional practices teachers are doing across their classrooms. We see the same type of model happening between schools. So I'm looking forward to even richer conversation in that aspect next year.
I just want to add that also tied in with, as you heard throughout the year, that we all were in the schools and we were using the same tools and looking for the same things that the principals were developing in their PLCs.
A pretty significant district-led initiative that we've been working on for several years has been multi-tiered systems of support. It's one of our 3 primary strategies. As I've said in the past, this has been a cohort model that has allowed us to provide very targeted training and coaching support specifically at the elementaries. We'll be working with our 3rd and final elementary cohort this year. We have now 6 buildings that have been implementing this and are working towards fidelity and have been seeing some success. Our cohort model was really to build capacity across the district. Instead of just leaning on one person or a small team to lead this work, we're building capacity between principals and teachers, and it's fun to watch them reach out to each other, knowing that there's certain things happening in other buildings. We've had teachers visit other buildings. We've had principals visit other buildings. We've had teams go together and meet together to problem solve and plan together. An example of that is we've had teams from across the district, teachers and principals, go visit Lester Park to see what they're doing with their WIN period, and they're trying to replicate that in their buildings. So that's just a specific example, but that is exciting work. We're building on our own internal experts within our district to do that work well. As a part of those conversations, we made a very intentional investment in Reading Wonders, which is our new ELA curriculum that is more appropriate aligned to the standards, and that's specifically for grades K through 5. Also, we have been working with this group to implement more structure around what interventions are we doing when students aren't at grade level. And so we've looked at literature, research, we've tapped into our curriculum department to really identify what are some of those resources that we need to have in the hands of teachers and what training do they need. We've identified leveled literacy intervention as a district-wide tool that we're using for students, and we're also using a tool called PRESS out of the University of Minnesota Center for Reading Research. They are offering us very targeted tools to be able to meet the needs of individual students, as well as provide some diagnostic assessments as well, so that we can really tailor our interventions to individual needs. In addition to that, we've increased our emphasis that all students need to receive core instruction. That includes special education students, and that interventions that students get are in addition to their core instruction. And potentially in the past, students may have been removed from core instruction to get a reading intervention, but we know that when students are behind in reading, they need more time in reading instruction. And so that's been a common practice across our buildings. And also we have worked to align our WINs at the secondary and the elementary to make sure there's some consistency happening there and that it's established across all of our schools, and that has been a valuable component.
Add to this piece as well that not only are we providing the resources there and the Reading Wonders and moving towards getting LLI and PRESS within the organization, but we're also providing training to support that. On our opening August 29th date coming up, we will be providing targeted training for Reading Wonders to our classroom teachers at the elementary and providing LLI and PRESS training for our intervention staff.
Just a couple more things I want to share before we talk a little bit more about our data and our results. Our other district initiative has been to implement PLCs, or professional learning communities. This has started several years ago with a variety of training. Most recently, we had training where we brought Solution Tree here last year. It was almost exactly a year ago, where our leadership teams came in and got 2 days worth of very high quality, I put powerful training. I think it was pretty powerful training, and the dialogue we had those 2 days were, I think, impactful. We've also developed the rubric that I shared with you a little bit earlier as part of the handbook. That rubric is really meant to guide teams to do a self-assessment to identify where are they currently functioning as a PLC, where do they want to be, and what kind of staff development or support do they need to get to the next level to ensure we're implementing those to fidelity. And so that's really the work now that's happening at the building level. Every team, every building is very much in a different spot. And so this tool is really meant to guide teams on their own individual staff development, and they, of course, can always tap into district resources when there are specific questions that come up in regards to that. And then, as I stated earlier, the PLC handbook was developed in order to articulate what is best practice and what are some common expectations that should be happening across all of our buildings. Anything you want to say about that?
I think I'd just piggyback on that by saying that I think we're really at a spot with PLCs where we've provided time for staff, for most of our staff for PLCs. We've provided some guidance from the district level. We're really at a spot where it's down to individual buildings honing in on their understanding of PLCs and supporting it at that level. We're certainly here as resources, like Amy said, but it's really, I think, drilled down to the point where it's the work of the buildings to move this forward.
And lastly, as you've heard me talk a lot about, our full-service community school model. And I do think we're getting more and more recognition across the state and the country, and that we're one of the few districts that has a K-12 model. And so we're continuing to expand that work. I was even just in a meeting today with our representatives from Myers-Wilkins, Lincoln Park, and Denfeld, looking at applying for specific grants to add other additional services such as after-school programming and transportation options and things like that. So this is ongoing work that we're very excited about, and we know this supports the whole child and gives them those additional supports that they need to make sure that learning can happen. Those, like I said, are the things that we're most connected to, that we're overseeing, directing, supporting. There are different and even more things happening at each individual school based on their individual comprehensive needs assessments that they've done as teams. Is there anything else that you guys want to share that in regards? Okay. All right. The next part is the data piece. Would you like that? Okay.
Yes, please. Wow, like if someone told me that we just talked about last year's results 3 months ago, I'd believe it. These years are just clicking by. Just a reminder, I just feel compelled every year to say this, and the commissioner said it as well when she had the press release, that our test scores, although they get a lot of emphasis and we talk about them a lot, they really are just one part of the picture. And that when we're talking about education, it does go beyond reading, math, and science. And how our students are doing, we're tracking that throughout the school year. It's an ongoing thing. It's just, this is the end of the year assessment that happens at one time that we tend to put a lot of emphasis on. A few reminders. When I'm talking about the test results, they're for 2 tests, and the reason for that is it includes all students in our district. So I'm talking about the results of the MCAs as well as the MTAS. The MTAS is the alternate test to the MCAs, where a very small percentage of our students take the exam. Our students with most significant cognitive disabilities take that test. So their results are also counted in the results I'll be talking about today. We also look at, for accountability purposes, students who are in our school district on October 1st, as well as on test day. And you've heard me say it before. The rationale behind that is if they were sitting in our school buildings on that date, October 1st, and on test day, we probably educated them for the school year. It omits students who come in on the fly the hour before a test. It's really looking at the kids that we've had for a period of time. One of the other things I just wanted to mention when we're looking at the results, especially with regard to students of different ethnic groups, they're going to look different than last year's results. So when I show you historic data, the numbers aren't going to match exactly. And the reason for that is Minnesota has now moved to the federal ethnicity guidelines, so there are more groups. So when, for example, in our district, the one group that we do have that's large enough to report on, the additional group, is 2 or more races. So when we're reporting on students who fall into that group and have for years previously, that's taking them out of a different group that they had been in. So the first thing I just wanted to show you is this is just a graphical depiction of where we've been and where we are in comparison to the state. If you look back 5 years ago, you can see that we were slightly below the state. The state, you can see, has remained pretty flat in overall achievement, while we've been making some slow but steady increases over time, to the point that now we are above the state. So when we started back 5 years ago, when the MCA 3 was first administered in reading, we were below the state, but we have been making those gains, and now we, because of that, we are above the state in reading. So just so that you can see, from 2012 to 2013, we've made an increase of 8.2 percentage points, whereas the state has made 2.5, so we've outpaced the state. This is a graph that looks at all of our student ethnic groups, including the new one this year, 2 or more races, and you can see a few things. You can see that our white students have made some slow but steady progress over the last 5 years. You can see that our Asian students, although their achievement has been up and down, that they are experiencing higher achievement now than they did 5 years ago. Our American Indian students also have had some slow but steady progress, as well as our Black students. You can also see that 2 or more races, we started out lower than we are now, but there's been some variation over time. This is looking at our special populations. So students who qualify for free or reduced price lunch, students who qualify for special education services, and our English language learners. You can see that we've, again, with free and reduced price lunch, we've made some slow but steady progress over the last 5 years in the area of reading. Special education has remained relatively stable, although we did see a bit of a decrease from last year to this year. Our English learner population is a pretty small group. Some years we don't have enough to report on them. That's why you don't see them in 2012-13. But we did have quite a decrease from 14-15 to 15-16, and we have stabilized there. Math, it's very similar to reading in that when 5 years ago, we were below the state, although you can see we were even further from the state average 5 years ago in the area of math. Again, the state really stabilized and has stayed pretty stagnant overall, where we've had some slow and steady progress, where now we're at the state average. If you look at it over since 11-12, which was the first since 11-12. You can see that we've raised 12 percentage points since then, whereas the state actually has dropped almost 3 percentage points. And this is looking at the same graph, looking at student achievement by ethnicity. You can see, again, our Asian students are making progress. Our white students have been making progress. 2 or more races, we have slow increases. American Indian, you can see we've made some pretty good gains if we look back starting at 2010-11 where we were at. And then our Black students, we've seen more variability in scores and are pretty much where we were at 5 years ago. If we look at our special populations, you can see that we made some gains with free and reduced price lunch with that group of students, but it's really stabilized over the last few years. Special education has also seen pretty stable results. If we look at science, again, if we look back 5 years ago, we were well below the state. We've been making some incremental gains over time, where now we're above the state, where the state has stayed relatively stagnant. In science, it's been over 14% increase in proficiency, 14 percentage points, and the state's been almost 2. And again, I'll just let you take a minute to look at the MCA science scores by ethnicity, but just I'll point out a couple of things here. 2 or more races, we're seeing some pretty quick overall increases there. Our white students have been making some pretty steady progress. Our Asian students, we've seen some variability. Our American Indian students overall have made some really nice progress, and our Black students have made pretty slow but steady progress over time.
Can I interject something here real quick, Tanya? We were just down at the MDE Back to School conference that they have every year, and we had a cohort of people from the district there attending together, and one of the people from the State Department actually approached our table and was actually very congratulatory, said that when they were looking at the science results for Duluth, well, actually when they were looking at the results, the science results from Duluth really stuck out to them as a real improvement. And they congratulated us essentially for the work that they know we've been doing around standards, identifying standards, and improving our instruction across the district for that work. And so just wanted to point out that it's not often that folks from MDE come up to you and congratulate you on the work they're seeing you do.
And this is the last slide. This is looking at science by special population. You can see some slow, but some increases over the last few years. So if we take all that together and try to squeeze out the themes, overall, in the last 5 or 6 years, we've had some pretty significant increases in district achievement. We have outpaced the state in all 3 of our content areas in those gains. In reading and science, we've had 5 years in a row of our scores increasing, and we're above the state average in both content areas. We've had consistent gains in our increases in our math scores over the last 5 years. Although last year to this year was pretty steady, even so we're now on par with the state. And one of the things is we're looking at our school results, which you have in your appendices, are the schools that received intensive coaching and training more so. They're the schools that have had the most gains over the last couple of years. And this is just a quick comparison at a glance of the 3 content areas. You can see that reading and science, over half of our schools increased in proficiency, nearly half did in math. In reading, we had most of our grades increasing in proficiency in science. If we looked at it by grade level for reading and math, however, most grades decreased in proficiency. So really what happened is the few grades that did increase made some very significant increases that helped bump the overall average up. Most of our student groups increased in proficiency in the area of science, and about half did in reading and math. If we look at achievement gap, the achievement gap increased or stayed the same for most groups when we looked at reading. It decreased or stayed the same for about half of the groups in science, and the achievement gap increased or stayed the same for about half of the student groups in math. And finally, if we look at state average, we have half of our schools above the state average in both reading and science, and over half of our student groups I'm talking about, half of our student groups are above the state average in both reading and science, and over half of our student groups are above the state average in math. So moving on, next steps.
Okay, just a couple more slides. I think overall, we're very proud of the results in different aspects of our data, but obviously there's still much work to do, and there are some specific populations of students that are not performing at the level that we want them to be performing at. So part of the next couple slides is what are we really going to do for all students to continue to impact our outcomes for students, and also specifically for those student populations. We're going to continue the work with MTSS and PLCs, going back to what Dr. Lake had just shared. The work where we're doing that work well, we're seeing some of the impacts, the greatest impacts. And so we know that that is a strategy that's working. We want to continue to just build upon that and continue to replicate, or to continue to implement that. And specifically in the area of MTSS, our focus has been literacy for the last couple years. I see us shifting probably now this year into how can that look for math instruction, especially at the elementary level. Although MTSS in literacy looks and feels different than it does for math. Developmentally, how kids learn math and reading is different. So, but still talking about how do we provide those same type of supports in the area of math that we have been for literacy. This goes back to what Dr. Carey was saying earlier, that we are looking ahead to support teachers with a new ELA curriculum this year, giving them training, and also helping them use this new material to best individualize the reading needs for each student using a balanced literacy model. And so giving them tools and resources to be able to differentiate for all the kids in their classroom. It's not just a matter of getting through a basal or getting through a book from pages 1 to 200. It's really about what are the resources to this curriculum to best meet the needs of each child in a classroom. The district has begun to look at what we have called an equity commitment, and so we really would like to do some more structured work this fall, talking about what does equity look like in ISD 709, what are we committed to, what's our vision, and we know that that takes a variety of stakeholders to do that work, and that should, that's important work that we would like to move forward with in the fall. Did you want to talk any more about that?
Just that we started off with a district team over the course of a couple of days, having conversations about where we've been and where we're going, and started this work on equity, and really wanted to lay out a process for what that would look like. And so, as Amy said, once school gets underway, we'll let people get settled in a little bit. We plan to start bringing people together around those topics. We also know that at the state level, very similar work is going on, and so we'll be watching closely what's coming from that level and from other districts as well, as we look to find some maybe equity tools to help us make decisions and how to plan for the future.
Okay. Working with the Office of Education Equity and the new integration plan, William has put together a very nice staff development model that he calls the CARE Academy. He's used the National Education Association's research, specifically looking at specific strategies teachers and educators can use to close the achievement gap. And so he's designing staff development for cohorts of teachers for the next 3 years to be able to look at that research and strategies and try to replicate those things across all of our buildings. Pathways to Teaching is a program we've learned about recently in the last 6 months or so, we have brought in a speaker from, is it University of Denver or Colorado? From the state of Colorado, yes, from a university in the state of Colorado, who has implemented this work well. What this is looking at how do we engage our current student population early in possibly, what's the word I'm looking for? Considering it, that wasn't the word I was looking for, but that'll work. Considering a teaching career, and getting their experiences early, getting them credits, and having this partnership with a local university or college where they can continue that path. And once they have achieved their teaching degree, they would be available to work back in our buildings. And this is specifically targeted for students of color, with the intent of increasing staff diversity. I think there's more and more literature coming out that talks about when students of color have teachers of color, they are far more successful. And so recognizing that that's an important part of what we need to be doing. This is a partnership we're looking to establish with the College of St. Scholastica, and actually our first meeting to talk about the planning for this is tomorrow. So that's work that is going to be going on. Well, not the first meeting, but the real implementation meeting is happening tomorrow. And then lastly, the last slide is our continued investment. We have been piloting and working through some software to monitor how we conduct standard-based assessments, and I'm going to let Mike talk a little bit about this one.
So just very briefly, we know a few things. We know one that because we measure our student achievement results based on an assessment that is specifically aligned to state standards, ensuring that our curriculum and instructions align to those standards is very important, and also monitoring student outcomes connected to that to see if we have the right curriculum plan and materials in place. We haven't had a good system right now that allows us to monitor that in a targeted way, and so we're working with a vendor that has a very nice system in place, and we're going to start doing some of the setup work so that if we wanted to move forward with broader deployment, we'd be able to do that. And that should really help us hone in on how students are doing standard by standard and help us understand how our systems are impacting that so we can improve things in a much more targeted way.
We're going to continue to expand and enhance our early childhood work and our programs and try to have as many opportunities for families to access those programs for kindergarten readiness. And there will be some work in this winter and spring, how we can improve that transition to kindergarten. We'll be looking at how can we better support families and students coming in the fall into kindergarten so that it feels like a seamless transition from preschool to kindergarten, as well as how do we make our kindergarten roundups warm, welcoming, and informational for our families so that they have a wonderful experience from the very beginning when they enter our buildings. So that's the work that we'll be doing throughout the year this year. We'll be investing in staff development. There was a specific allocation in this year's budget to provide some staff development for special education staff. We're looking at both elementary and secondary, how they can receive more support when it comes to best practices in special education, reading interventions, and how to support students with challenging behavior. And so we've been working a lot this summer to map that scope and sequence out and make sure that we're using those dollars as efficient as possible. We'll continue training and support for our continuous improvement teams. The focus this fall and winter is going to shift. How do we support those teams who are implementing those teams who are implementing instructional practices across classrooms? How do we monitor that work to make sure that that's happening to fidelity? And then lastly, more intentional effort around chronic absenteeism. We could have some of the best teaching and learning happening across the state, but if students aren't in the classroom, that's going to make an impact. And so really being able to look at our data and talk about how are we getting the message out and how are we taking away barriers if attendance is an issue for students. We've done a nice, I think the partnership between Lutheran Social Services and the County Attorney's Office has been much improved over the last few years. We've seen some impact of that, but we want to see change happen much earlier than when we get to that level of intervention. We want it to, and much earlier. Much of that work has happened at the secondary level. We feel we need to push that down more into the elementary level.
I just wanted to add that as we were taking a deep dive into some of our data, we saw that attendance overall had taken a dip across the district, except for in 2 schools, and that was at Lincoln and Denfeld. Both of them increased their attendance rates. And so taking a look at some of the work that they've been doing specifically around that so that we can apply it to the rest of the district. But it's also a focus of the state now too, as we find the new standards coming out from the state based on ESSA include attendance as one of the measurements. And so it goes right along with what we've been looking at focusing on ourselves all along.
One other smaller item that we are working on this year that we didn't add to the list was that at Denfeld and East, we are, with a population of students who have had some difficulty in math, are piloting different math instructional materials that take a different focus on how to teach and learn math, to then monitor whether or not those materials provide us better results for student achievement than what our past materials had, and then if so, have a plan in place for adopting those to be able to support that.
And then the last part of the presentation are just more ways of looking at data, so I won't go through those, but those are available for you as well. And we can take questions if there are any.
Hey, Member Oswald?
If you can imagine, I have a few, so I'll just keep looking around after each one and yield the floor whenever it's necessary.
We'll just start with one at a time and we'll go that route.
And so my first one is when we're talking about the reading and math interventions, you mentioned that we're going to move to intervention that's in addition to the core instruction. Now, is that saying that we're not going to use the term is, I'm losing the term, where we have a special ed teacher in a team taught classes? Is that not the focus now, and we're trying something else?
Good question. I see it as a continuum, and so it starts with, and when we talk about special education, it's least restrictive environment. So some students might benefit from a team taught setting, and that's the support they need, and they're getting the support in grade level standards. But students might need more in addition to that. They might need more targeted reading intervention, social emotional skills, math support, and so that could be in addition to or instead of, depending on the student's IEP. There will still be some team taught opportunities at both of our high schools. But at the elementary, we don't do a lot of team teaching. It's mostly collaboration at the PLC level. And the what I need period at the elementary level has become a period where students have about 30 minutes of designated time that if they're below grade level, they get targeted intervention. If they need special education support, they get that intervention. Or if they need enrichment, they receive that support at the same time too. So nobody's missing out on any core instruction. So that's been the traditional model at the elementary.
Okay, I have a question about special ed too for Dr. Lake. Maybe you said this, but how many special ed students took the alternative test about? And how is that determined? Is that by their choice? That's what I thought.
I'll answer the easy one first.
Okay.
The way it's determined, there is specific eligibility criteria. So each fall I go out to each of the schools and I meet with their special education teams and their building administrator. And we talk about what that criteria is. It's very specific. The first thing is students must have a significant cognitive disability. Now the state doesn't tell us if it's an IQ score, or they don't give us a set number, but they do give us some conditions that need to be met. So the student's functioning needs to be impaired across settings, so not just in reading or math, that they need extensive support in other settings. So when they're out on the playground, when they're in the cafeteria, when they're out in the community, they do need some additional support. So that we have kind of a decision-making flow chart that each of our teams go through, and you know, those are the main things that are within that decision-making tree. As far as, the exact number, I could get back to you on that, but I want to say it's 150-ish.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Member Carla?
Thank you. I just want to say, first of all, thank you. I liked how you laid it out this year to talk about what's currently happening. Oftentimes we go to data and don't actually look at the full picture of what's currently happening, what's happening because of what we're happening or because of other things, and then how we're going to address it. So I just wanted to make sure to highlight that I appreciate the change in the model and the team approach to, it's really nice to see the team presenting together. So thank you for that. I want to also highlight the piece where you talked about the equity commitment in the Care Academy. I think sometime in talking with a number of community members, it's felt like it's easy to pull a token card saying, we're going to talk about equity, and I'm really committed to investing in supporting that conversation through the end of my tenure on the board and beyond, because it needs to be that deep piece. And so I look forward to hearing kind of that process and hope that is as you begin it, you bring it back to the board and it's a discussion back and forth, because we also need to be really publicly talking about this. And then also just, I'm glad to hear, what I'm hearing are a lot of things that have bubbled up from community members talking about raising leaders. And so you're seeing it at a national level, pairing evidence-based with what our community is reading and wanting. And so I'm hearing a lot that you're listening to our community in what you're talking about. I am glad to hear that we are at pace or outpacing much of the state, but as a board member, I'm still real, and I know you're concerned. You talk about this a lot. We're all very concerned, especially that our communities of color, especially African American students, are struggling. And so I want to be very clear that that's, I know that we're doing everything we can, yet we can also do better. And so look forward to hearing specifically how those are going to be addressed, partnering with community agencies. Because kids, at our hearts, we love kids, and that's why we care about kids, but it's really sad when they're not succeeding. So it's not okay. So thank you so much for your work, and I look forward to continuing to partner with you all.
Thank you. Chair Kirby?
Oh, thanks. This is, I guess, for Dr. Carey. I know we have a new math curriculum in the past 2 years.
We've had the same math curriculum for a number of years, but what happened was typically standards review cycles, which is what drives our curriculum material purchasing cycle, was historically about a 7-year cycle at the state. So every 7 years they would revise and redo the standards, which would then drive our going out to purchase new materials that align. What happened was at the state level, they redid that timeline. And so we had consumable materials that were purchased through what was anticipated to be the reauthorization of new standards. But since that reauthorization didn't happen, we now have these number of years until the new standards come out where we needed to purchase more materials. So over the last few years, you've seen us every year purchasing some new consumable workbooks for students. They are the old curriculum that we've had in place. It's just we've had to purchase more every year until we hit that reauthorization of standards and make any formal change. I feel like I didn't explain that terribly clearly. But.
No, I understand. I was just looking at it personally. I think my daughter and my son had different math. How they were taught math was different. And it seemed much improved with my son and my daughter. And I thought that was due to some change in, other than just the workbooks. And
that could be, I mean, if you remember, we currently have a lot of staff development and training that happens every year where our curriculum specialists are meeting with our teachers and providing them different approaches to how they teach different concepts that evidence would suggest are more successful. So you might just see some shifts in teaching practice that are happening.
Right, but that's fine, that's good. But I would assume that takes time and that you might see an initial drop as teachers change.
Yep.
change the approach, and then over time it would improve, which it's certainly has.
Sometimes you do.
Yeah.
There's kind of a well-researched phenomenon that they call the implementation dip.
Yeah.
And if it's a graph, you'll see like a flat line, then a slight dip, then usually an increase, and then another plateau, which is people are learning something new, so you see a slight dip during that period. But if it's a better strategy, then you start to see gains until you reach your new normal.
Right, and that would be true for all subjects, not just for math.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I have a question. Chair Kirby, I have 4 different kids who all learn math 4 different ways. And they all had great teachers teaching them. I have a question about, you had mentioned the NEA research for closing the achievement gap. Is that it was listed on there. Is there some information you could share with us on kind of handout kind of stuff?
There's a whole packet.
I'm sure there is, but can you, like a summary of it? Yeah, that would be great for background information. Appreciate that. Member Oswald?
I can't let this meeting pass without bringing up the bottom schools. As a district, we've improved, and we read these positive headlines, and yet my community in Western Duluth feels left out of that positivity because MacArthur and Stowe and Denfeld are the lowest scores, especially in math. Denfeld is at 27%. That is clearly unacceptable, and yet they read headlines and hear in the news that, the district's improving and doing so much better, and it's clearly not for certain school populations. So given that we talked a lot about reading interventions and specific strategies and that sort of stuff, I am wanting to know what specific math strategies are we going to look at these specific schools to help them the most, because they're most needy. Especially at Denfeld, the performance is lower than even free and reduced lunch students. I mean, free and reduced lunch students, I believe, is 41, 42, something like that, what I looked at. And Denfeld is 27. So we can't blame poverty. Every other student group besides black students are doing better than Denfeld. So we can't blame diversity. So what is it? And so what is going on to target these specific populations or I shouldn't say populations, the general population at these schools to help them, because something's not working there?
I do want to point out Denfeld Reading increased nicely. I don't know if that's the right word, but we were proud of those gains. And I know Principal Scotniers was very proud of that, and they were very intentional this year about the reading strategies they've been teaching. They've taken designated time at staff meetings to talk about how can you embed more text into your content, whether you're a social studies or a science or a math teacher, and how do you teach students how to read difficult text if they can't read that, regardless of whether it's an English class. And so I know they did do some very intentional work, and that work will continue. In regards to the math, I would agree with everything you said, and that does play into the comment that Dr. Carey had made earlier. They were specifically identified and had participated in some training that occurred and are looking to implement and pilot. Would you say it's new? It's not just curriculum, it's instructional practices. And this is my analogy, and I don't know if this is always accurate, but we know that students need more differentiation, and to sit in rows and to hear information for a bulk of a class period and have time to do homework isn't probably the best strategy in teaching math. And so how can we give little pieces of information? How can we provide small group instruction or individual instruction based on student need? And I know that was part of the conversation and the training. You can talk more about that.
So the couple pieces I would mention is that one is the math piece that we are taking a look at both Denfeld and East for our populations that need some more support. What it is it's an intentional attempt to look at different instructional practice. So there is a new material set, but the material set supports a different philosophy in how you teach math, which we're really hoping we'll see positive results from. And with that, the teachers that have agreed to participate from our sites are going down to specific training on what those different instructional approaches look like and how they operate, and then how to implement them in the classroom for next year. So that's one part of trying to address that. The other kind of indirect piece I would mention is that we have evidence from other schools across the country that when you focus heavily on reading instruction, that if you make really strong gains there, you see gains across all other content levels, because as students become better readers, they're able to better understand the other content that they're running across throughout their learning, and it shows kind of a cumulative effect or gain across other areas. That's why I think we've really cognizantly focused intentionally on reading instruction and reading improvement first. Doesn't mean we can forget about math, but that's kind of where we prioritize now, with the idea that that would reap kind of additional gains in other areas. But the high school focus on, it's called CPM, if you're ever interested in looking it up, that's the name of the program, that we're piloting this next year is an intentional attempt to start focusing on some of that math work.
And so are the students involved in that math work? How are they identified, and are they voluntary recipients to be within those classes, or are they just assigned? How are they identified, I guess?
Okay. That's a good question. I don't have all the details right off the top of my head. I can't remember them all off the top of my head. Oh, you do? Well, then I'll let you go first.
I just remember. Okay. Patty told me. Okay. I believe it's Algebra 1. And so all Algebra 1 classes are the classes that are going to be participating in this work. So there's more than one section of Algebra 1 at Denfeld. I don't know if it's 2 or 3 sections. And then East has 1 section. So those will be the sections that will be focusing on this work.
And just as a reminder, that Algebra 1 now is no longer considered a high school level course. You're required by state law to introduce Algebra 1 in 8th grade, and so what we're doing is we're specifically targeting a population of students that we know have had some difficulty, with the idea that if we see some real gain there, then we know that this works for the populations that we most need to help and support, and that we would consider a shift to that more broadly.
So would these classes be in addition to their regular math class, or at the same time? And are we implementing math labs still? And what curriculum supports our math labs?
So for this will be in place of. So for a lot of our students, because math tends to be so sequential, it's very difficult if they haven't mastered a concept or a broad range of concepts in a course to move them on. These are kids who really are taking Algebra 1 again. We have had and continue to have math labs. We've talked about whether or not we want to stick with that model or how we reframe it as we move forward. The biggest hitch we've had at the secondary level with trying to implement a strong MTSS system has been some of the limitations within our schedule and some of our other course design. It's fair to say, I think, that we as an organization have what we tend to call required electives, meaning they're courses that aren't required by statute, but we've required them locally. One of the pieces we could review going forward is moving away from some of those required electives and then starting to use some of that time for better intervention structures. But part of the conversation that we're having right now, we just met today actually, in reviewing, doing that work to review secondary schedule choices, is we have a very intentional portion where we're trying to define what our intervention times are that are needed at the secondary level, so we can do a better job of putting tiered intervention in place for our secondary students. Because right now, to be very honest, we piecemeal that together a little bit based on some of our schedule constraints.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Carey. Member Harla?
I just had a question about, and I thank you for your question, Member Oswald. It was a good question. You were talking about schools that were working in cohorts for MTSS. Laura MacArthur was one, correct? No, they weren't. So they weren't implementing that. So will they be a part of this next group?
Yes, so the schools that we worked with most closely this past year was Congdon and Myers-Wilkins, and Stowe will be revitalized, I think, this year. We've kind of lost focus a little bit in a couple different aspects at Stowe, but with our with the principal who's there now, we're going to move forward with MTSS specifically supporting that academic piece. Moving into this year, Laura Mack, Homecroft, and Lakewood will be getting targeted support for MTSS.
So if I'm hearing correctly from before, the schools that were implementing MTSS to Fidelity saw gains. So we have a track record as a district where we've seen gains. We have the infrastructure that is in place. And so now the schools that we have seen that are struggling, that maybe they didn't fully implement it to Fidelity, we have a track record and a way to support them to see better gains and to support those teachers and students.
So for example, Piedmont in the last 2 years has gone up 10 percentage points in reading. Myers-Wilkins has gained. Lowell stabilized a little bit but made some really nice gains initially. Congdon made some nice gains this year. And and Lester Park has made some nice gains. The other piece too that special education piece is a big conversation in that we need to make sure those students are getting core instruction, and in those buildings that have greater percentage of students who receive IEP or have IEPs, that's even a more important conversation as well. Okay. So,
how do we prioritize? It feels like everything's important, right? How do we have the discussion? How as administration do you guys have the discussion with administrators? And maybe I'm asking a bag of worms or opening a bag of worms. Wait. Can of worms. Sorry.
So there's candy worms. There's bags of candy worms. Yeah.
Thank you. How do you have that conversation about what's most important when you feel like, so from a principal is having to track a lot of stuff, and teachers are having to track a lot of things, and they're thinking about everything from a parent who decides to take a vacation for a week when they don't need to be on vacation, when schools don't have a vacation, and then they've got another student who has an IEP who's really struggling and needs specific support, and then they like parents with high energy points or low energy points or involvement. How do you coach our administrators through how to make decisions about what's most important to address today, and then how do you have them coach them on giving time to look for the future?
Well, doing a needs assessment is a big part of that, and looking at what are the needs of the community, but also in teacher PLCs, looking at the student data. What's coming up as the tough things this week? It's not a case of one and done. Like, this is the intervention that is going to fix everything. It's really taking it a day, a week, a month at a time, and looking at the standards that we're working on and how the students are doing with these standards, and being able to be fluid and flexible with how we are addressing the needs of our students and their families and the community as a whole. And that's the importance of the work behind the full service community schools, is addressing those needs as they come up, and the work of our PLCs, both with our teachers and our principals, because we can be responsive to the data, and that's what really we need to do. I think the days of, these are my lesson plans from 20 years ago. I've been using this for 20 years. That's long gone. We have to be nimble and changing and reflexive, just like any other field right now. If you're not changing quickly and being responsive, then we're not going to make it. And that's the skill we're most focusing on.
I do want to just add one additional thing to Member Oswald's question, that one of the things I am really excited about is an intervention that we have training coming up in September for press, as I talked about earlier, has a very targeted intervention for students who are below grade level, but it also has an intervention. So if you have a class where where more than 50% of your students are not on target with a specific skill, it gives you a classroom intervention to do with all of your students. And so you can't have too many students needing an intervention, because then it's no longer an intervention. So you have to reduce the amount of students who need that level of support. And that I am really excited about, and we're going to be very targeted in the schools that we are providing that training and those materials to, specifically Myers, Piedmont, and Laura Mack and Stowe have been invited to that.
I wanted to go just a little deeper on Member Harla's question.
Can I just follow up with, you mentioned 4 schools, who will be at that training?
That training will be for classroom teachers, principals, school psychologists, a special ed rep, and interventionists. So it's really a team. It's meant to be a team where they'll learn about how to implement this and then bring this back to their schools.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Dr. Carey.
The piece that I would highlight is that the really intentional work we've done around creating these continuous improvement teams, and then that ties into the school improvement process, and a key part of that is looking at data and using your data to really hone in on what your key priorities are. So now you have a core group of people holding each other mutually accountable to a plan that they've created together that focuses in on what the data says are their key needs. So I think that's really the purpose of all of these structures, is to kind of do what you just said. How do you separate out all these really important things and hone in on what's most important and keep that focus? And I think that's the whole intent of the continuous improvement teamwork that we've been doing.
Did you have another question, Member Harlow?
I just had a follow-up to that.
Okay, go ahead.
Kind of a two-part follow-up. One thing, I'm assuming correctly from experience being out of the schools and talking to teachers, when you talked about not teaching the way 20 years ago, the overwhelming majority of our teaching force is not in that spot. That we have teachers that are working every day to innovate, that are showing up for their kids in such new ways. I mean, even hearing some of the outcomes as we were talking about the negotiation panels and hearing them worrying about mental health pieces is showing that they're really evident and looking at what's in the needs of their classrooms. Just want to make sure that the narrative isn't teachers are bad. I didn't hear you saying that, but I want to make sure that we're clear that it's about making a stronger system to support kids and achievement.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's exactly what we see. We see teachers engaging in the process and digging in and being excited about addressing the needs of kids and really looking at data in a new way.
In addition to that, I am so proud of the staff that I work with on a daily basis, and the amount of energy, enthusiasm that when we have staff development opportunities, people are eager, they want to be innovative, they want to learn. It is incredibly refreshing to be in a district that is so eager, and so it's been fun. We've had, and I've said it before here, we've had folks in the summer who are learning on their own time. At sometimes we want, they're looking at innovative ways of scheduling, and so it's exciting to be part of that team.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure, because sometimes there's sentiments as different thing comes up, and I just want to be very clear. Our educators are great. And then one area I didn't notice in the process was discussions about PBIS, and is that still a tool that will be implemented district-wide within the PLCs? That's just a question about how does that tie into this too?
That's a good question. So when I talk about MTSS, I talk about both sides of the triangle, both academic and social-emotional. We have been probably more intentional on the academic side of that triangle in the last 2 years, and I've been meeting with Ron Lake over the summer, and we want to be more intentional about the other side of the triangle. We have more schools who are trained and who are implementing PBIS and sustaining PBIS, but there are some foundational or fundamental things that we can do across all schools, whether you've been a part of the MDE training or not. So that is work that we are looking at scaling up this year.
Thank you.
Great. Member Oswald and then Member Kirby.
I guess I just have two comments. The first is about pathways to teaching. I think it's absolutely essential that we recruit our kids to want to teach here. In order for that to happen, we have to give them positive experiences while they're here, and we need to work towards that goal. The challenge there that was fully, acknowledged at that session with the Colorado person that was here was that the room in the schedule is not there to accommodate these two classes, their junior and senior years, because you wouldn't be able to take college-bound classes in order to get into college and meet college requirements by taking these classes. So I understand the challenges there. We need to work on that. The second comment I have is about the absenteeism rates. I read something online that it's more the statistic of getting lucky in a way of not getting sick. People just are lucky if they don't get sick and not come, that they get to come to school every day and because they're not sick. I have a problem with how we count absences. I think it's a detriment to people. I mean, I don't know what the state requires, but you know, I still refer back to when my daughter got strep throat and was out for 5 days, and it didn't go away, and then a week later she was out for 4 more days, and yet she was counted as 9 days absent when it was really 2 instances. And I really hope that we focus more on the instances of she was sick twice versus she was sick for 9 days, because she was immediately placed in the truancy problem category at being gone for 9 days. And that's a problem. And, you know, those letters are quite intimidating that get sent out for, you know, threatening truancy and reminding people of the importance of being available and, you know, being in school and present. You have to be present to learn, but there are challenges that present themselves that are beyond our controls. So I always hope that we're thoughtful in how we handle those situations.
Just to comment on that, we use the definition from the state on chronic absenteeism, which is the number of, which is 10% absent, whether it's excused or unexcused. But part of the reason the message behind that bullet point on the presentation is not about punishment, not about punishing students, but about taking away barriers if there are barriers. And so the full-service community school, their hope is that if we are able to connect families quickly to medical or health resources that will help address that. That's one of the data points that they want to use to monitor that work. The other thing is, you know, we as educators play a part in that too, in making sure that all students feel welcome and engaged, and so that plays into it too. We have some control over that.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. I understand we are under legal obligations to meet absenteeism requirements and that sort of thing, but it truly is, you know, who gets a germ and who doesn't. And many people come to school sick and get other people sick in the process, and other people take way too long because they want to make sure they're not sick anymore before they come back. You know, it runs the gamut, but I really hope we're sensitive to the needs of our population. And I think Denfeld and Lincoln Park, being that they're the 2 schools with the least amount of absenteeism, I guess that's the way to put it, is a positive towards the community school models working and creating those opportunities to help them be healthier.
They're not hopefully the least. They just have been the 2 schools that have made growth in reducing. Yeah,
sure. Yeah, thank you for that correction.
Yeah. Thank you. Chair Kirby?
Thank you. A couple of comments. One is, I think, ultimately, we want the ability to identify specific students and their needs. And I hope that the new software we're getting or the data, we can do that with our data. And although we rightly concentrate on the achievement gap, there are students doing well who could do better. And I don't think we should lose track of the people who are doing well who could do better. And there are parents who are concerned about this, and I think we need to focus on them as well and provide for that. And then one other thing, maybe Dr. Lake, is there any way we can, or we do, track homeless students? Because I know that's a big increasing problem, and how they're doing or what we're doing around that issue.
Yeah, that will be another group of students that we'll be reporting on separately moving forward.
To piggyback on your comment, or to speak directly to it, you talked about monitoring students who are also doing well but could do better, and the software piece. The software system we're looking at, first I just want to note that it will take an investment into next year if we're going to use it more broadly. We're doing the setup work now that we would need to do to be ready for that, should we make that decision. But the software actually tracks student achievement result by standard for every single student. And so not only does it allow you to look at how every single one of our students is doing standard by standard, but there are also some reporting tools that allow you to see how students are doing across a grade level or across a building or across a standard for the entire district. So you can start to gauge, do we have an instructional issue? Do we have a curricular issue? Do we have an individual student achievement issue? So we should be able to start to better diagnose all of those pieces.
Great. Okay. Thank you for a great discussion. The only other comment I had on this is just a quick comment, is that I'm actually hoping that we have more discussion on some of the ideas that came out of our 2 days in July on community schools, the ideas from the community around absenteeism and that information is shared with us and that as well, because I thought there was a lot of great discussion that afternoon, so, and ideas. Okay, so we can move on then. We have a placeholder with grant applications. Do we have anything? No? Okay. Nothing on regulations. And then action items, no additional presentations. Under policies, 5084, this is the second reading of the bullying policy. 5084, deletion of that, and then, and that's the second reading.
Rosie.
And okay, and Ron is here. We had a lot of discussion in the last meeting, but Ron Lake is here to answer any questions. Member Harla, do you have a question about that?
I just had a question that it says first reading on it, so it'll just need to read second reading in the bound packet for next week. Thank you.
Let's see.
I see second.
No.
On page 2, it says new policy advised as MSBA's rule for the first reading. This policy would replace policy 5084.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
so,
And under the recommendation, it says second reading.
Yeah.
so it's the second reading. Thank you for catching that.
Just a detailed nerd question.
Okay.
Thanks.
Any questions for Ron? We had a lot of discussion last month. Okay, great. Thank you. And then C, our data sharing agreements. We have 3 minutes. Thank you, Ron. Thanks for staying. Menace Peacemakers, Duluth Area YMCA, YWCA, and Girl Power. Placeholder on grant awards, and then on 11 different diploma requests. And future items will be additional policy updates. So that is the Education Committee.
Can I ask one
You may,
final
Chair
question?
Kirby.
I just want an update on the Starbase program. Is that going forward?
We are having conversations tomorrow, I believe, to talk through forward progress on that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Have a good evening. Go enjoy the nice night. 5:35, the Education Committee closes. Okay.
Mark that one down.
Mark that one down, yes. Thank you.